This presentation is by Linda Peters and Lynn Branson. Linda and Lynn are both members of ReClam the Bay and are shining examples of one reason that some people join our organization. Although not formal students of marine biology, they are citizen scientists of the highest order. Linda and Lynn attended the coastal stewardship classes established by the Barnegat Bay Shellfish Restoration Project, administered through Rutgers Cooperative Extension by Dr. Doug Zemakis, PhD, and became certified shellfish gardeners. Now, they used some of what they learned and their own inquisitive minds to frame some questions that they then went into the bay to find answers to. But they realized that the observations provided some understanding, but also more and more questions. They shared the questions and the answers that they were searching for with members of ReClam the Bay. The group then shared those questions with some of the faculty of the coastal stewardship course. The result has been a deeper understanding of the life in the bay. Now, one final note. Observations do not require permits or licenses. However, handling and collecting shellfish may require both, so be sure and check with New Jersey DEP, Bureau of Shell Fisheries, and you just simply Google that, and also visit reclaimthebay.org. Take it away, Linda.
Well, thank you for taking the time to come to this presentation. This is an update of year 2 of a project which we have focused on monitoring and observing the formation and deformation of natural oysters in Barnegat Bay in the High Bar region. This presentation will go over what we changed or what changed in 2021. 2021, what we observed and learned, and a preview of what we plan to change or accomplish in 2022. This is a collaborative project with Lynn Branson, who is here with me. She has assisted me in taking pictures, recording data, and helped put this presentation together. I'm also appreciative of Rick Bushnell, who obtains the necessary permits and shadows the project. And also, I would like to give a big shout out to Matthew Gregg, whose oyster farm, 40 North, in my opinion, is the greatest contributing factor to positive ecological changes we are seeing in the High Bar region. Next slide.
I'm going to step away and do some behind the scene action.
Next slide, please. If you put the pointer on this circle, Rick.
My pointer has died, so I'm using my little cursor. But
okay. Well, this circle is where I spend most of my time. It's one of my favorite places to be, right inside Barnegat Inlet. But these maps are giving you an idea where we are. Here's the Sedge Island sedges. Sea Island sedges. Here is High Bar Harbor, and then the dike that is right off of it, the state park. And to the left here is Clam Island. And down at the bottom of the circle is the Sedge Islands of High Bar. And in the upper right-hand corner is where Matthew Gregg's farm is. Well, when Matthew Gregg started this farm in 2016, I noticed an uptick in the amount of oyster spat seen. But at that time in 2016, it was observed that 95% of these oyster spat did not live beyond 6 months. I would rarely see an oyster survive throughout the winter, and it really bothered me, and I really wanted to figure out why. And as I watched them spat and die, I wanted to find a way to help the oyster spat I was seeing survive, to help them grow to adulthood, and then in time, possibly use them to create a natural oyster reef. I joined ReClam the Bay in 2019, learning and becoming involved with people with the same interests. Next slide, please. Natural oysters in Barnegat Bay at one time covered parts of the bay floor, most parts of the bay floor. They have died out historically due to overharvesting, disease, environmental change, siltation, and cold weather exposure. In High Bar, what we're seeing is the natural larva of oysters setting on the mussel beds, on the mussel shells along the shoreline, because there is no other available substrate for them to set on. They often set high on the mussel bed, as seen here on the right. And this one is not very healthy. It's dark, it's thin. The ones setting high on the mussel bed are almost always dead by the following spring. Mussels tolerate cold exposure much better than oysters, as they have a natural antifreeze within them. It would seem likely that if this oyster was lower on the bed, it would survive. Yet unfortunately, as it grows, the weight of the oyster in unstreamlined shape against the current makes them vulnerable to fracture, pull mussels off the bed, and fall into the silt. And once they fall into the silt, they often fall head first, not yet, head first, and the oyster succumbs, starves due to siltation and suffocation. Mm-hmm. Silt and cold exposure, picture on the left, are the largest reasons, in my opinion, for today's natural oyster death in the High Bar region. It's our observation that the cold exposure affects the young spat more than year-old or two-year-old oysters. My earlier thoughts were, if we capture these young spat that I knew would die, raise them in an environment where they could be healthy, and then move them back out into the sedges when healthy, we would resultantly see more spat formation in the area. After 2 years of doing this, along with Matt Gregg's farm, we are witnessing and seeing more spat generation and more oysters and a longer life of oysters living in High Bar than ever before. The oysters that we have moved out into the sedges are doing well in their selective spots. Next picture, please. So the oyster is spatting on the mussel, and this unstreamlined shape, when the current pushes against them, when the current pushes against this oyster, it will either, this picture on the bottom right is showing you how it fractured off of the mussel. You still see a tiny piece of the mussel attached.
Right.
And then it either fractures off the mussel, or it pulls the entire mussel or a colony of mussels off of the bed, and it falls onto the floor. And unfortunately, the head falls first. That's the heaviest part. It gets covered with silt and it dies. Next slide, please. So it's just really fantastic that people all over this country, all over the world, are trying to restore oysters, and they understand all the benefits that these oysters generate to our bays. My brother sent me this article from San Diego. This article is, this study was a study from Christine Thompson and her crew, looking at the oysters right here in Barnegat Bay. Just last week, there was a great article in the New York Times, an article about Jamaica Bay, right near the Queen area, Queens in New York City, and they're doing a huge oyster restoration project. Next page, next picture, please. But what complicates things is every year is different, and every year changes take place, and you gotta understand that these changes are taking place and adapt what you're doing to these changes. This past winter was very mild, and there's my dog on the right, but the waters were deeper. this past fall and winter, we had deeper waters. It was difficult to get our counts that we wanted to get. We had a EFT tornado rip through High Bar, damaging 20 boats and making 11 homes uninhabitable. Went over right over one of my sites. Of course, no underwater damage. There was a humpback whale that washed up on the beach this year in the winter of 2021, allowing for an educational experience. Just amazing. We saw little, this picture of Wigeon grass on the right, we saw little or no Wigeon grass at all in 2021, but we're awestruck by its color in 2020. I think that was due to the deeper water. Next slide, please. So let's get on to our story of 2021.
Ta-da.
We have utilized and developed 3 methods to observe oyster growth, lifespan, and spat production. And that is through the use of observation cages on the left, shell bags in the center, and mini reefs. We're going to look at each one of these methods and share what we did differently in 2021, what we observed and learned, and what we plan to do going forward. Next slide. Well, first of all, it's been quite a chore, and I think I drove Lynn a little crazy, repeatedly changing our sites.
Yes, you did.
The siltation changed, the currents changed, we lost sedge in certain areas, but we did finally, by the end of this past summer, we feel our sites are easy to manage and in very good locations. Next slide, please. So with the observations, cages, what did we do differently? This picture on the left, we took the observation cages and we used to have it very close to the sedge island, but that's where the siltation is the softest. In the middle of the channel, it's much more firm. It was a lot easier to manage. So we moved them to the middle of the channel. So we took the substrate out of our oyster observation cages because last year we saw no spat formation at all on these clams. We had a lot of oyster spat on the live oysters. We concluded last year that the oysters, if they had live oysters next to substrate, the spat knew it and preferred to be on the live oysters. We worked this year to make the cages lighter. I'm in my 6th decade and we need to keep them light.
They were heavy.
Next page, please. So what did we learn from the observation cages? Well, number one, we saw less spat formation on our oysters in the observation cages this year. And that is, we believe, because number one, the oysters were older, and number two, they weren't as clean as in 2020. We used to hose them down, but because we weren't getting siltation this year, there was really no need to do that, we felt. The larva, though, we concluded, seems to like to spat on young, clean oysters. Mm. We saw less fauna generation when we took the substrate away. We concluded, and this wasn't just observation cages, but that the fauna likes to be drawn, likes the combination of substrate and live organisms. We had much less silt coverage this year and minimal oyster deaths in our observation cages. And we continue to enjoy the fauna. I just find it fascinating how much shrimp we get in these traps in the wintertime. And black-fingered mud crabs is year-round the most popular fauna. Next picture, please. What do we plan to do moving forward with these cages? We are going to clean 2 observation cages and not clean the other 2. Watch the difference of fauna generation and oyster spat generation. We're going to have one observation cage with very young oysters and one over a year old. Watch the difference in spat generation. We're going to return some substrate to 2 observation cages and keep 2 with live oysters only. Again, observe the differences in fauna and spat generation. Next page, please. Shell bags. What did we do differently this year? We separated all the live shell bags from the substrate bags and developed 2 distinct and separate sites. We added more live shell bags to the live sites. We moved, as illustrated on this top picture, the shell bags higher in the mussel column, using the mussels and the plant root structure to support the bag, and found this was much easier to maintain. Next picture, please. What did we observe and learn? Spat generation was the greatest. And there's 2 pictures showing you the beautiful oysters generated around the live shell bags in the mussel column.
For sure.
Spat generation was not as great around the substrate bags. We also learned, and it was more confirmed, that the shell bags in year 2 did not generate as much spat as year 1. Again, we feel this is because the oysters like to spat on younger and clean oysters. These bags tend to be large fauna generators of small fish. And it doesn't seem to matter whether it's substrate or live organisms. They like them both. New page, please. New picture. So what did we observe? Okay, I'm sorry, I went through that already. Next picture. So here are 2 of our sites. So now we have the number 1 is our live substrate on the left, and our just substrate. Live organisms on is number 1, and substrate is number 2. We got rid of number 1 on Clam Island. The currents were just too big. The silt was too soft. And we established just the 2 areas, one with the live substrate, live organisms, and one with the substrate. Next page, please. So we are taking data in various projects as we move along, and this is just one of our data forms. And what these red pointers are highlighting is what we are seeing the most in terms of the most growth. So in the 1 high bar site, we started with a count of 27 in a 50-foot area around our live shell bags. And now the fall count was at 118, multiplied by 5. In another site, not as successful, we went from 22 to 46. We had a lot of trouble in the fall getting these counts because the water never went below the mussel beds. But we did last week. We've got a full moon this week, and we're out there. We got our numbers at every single site. This 118 over the winter went down to 108. So we always lose some in the winter. This 46 was still in the low 40s. And then Clam Island 2 and 3, which started at 0 and 7, were both in the 40s. Next picture, please. So shell bags moving forward, what do we plan to do? We would like to add new shell bags with only live oysters in an effort to create more larvae in different areas within the sedges. We would like to add 2 to 4 shell bags of live oysters in the dike region and develop an educational site in the dike region that people can walk out to. These sites are a little difficult to get to.
That'd be pretty cool.
Next slide, please. Mini reefs. I always like these mini reefs. What did we do differently this year? We brought the mini reefs off the bay floor because we were getting too much silt coverage, and the oyster drills killed all our young spat, almost all of it, the prior year. We raised them off the floor by placing them on our observation cages or on blocks of concrete. Because there were so many fractures in 2020, we made the mini reefs more dense by packing the oysters closer together. It was hoping that the oysters would support each other and we would see less breakage. New picture, please. So we learned a lot this year. This picture on the left illustrates these two mini reefs were on the floor. This was before I moved them off the floor. They were on the floor. The one on the left was in a silt area, which it was way too soft. And I wasn't able to get there for 3 or 4 weeks, got there, pulled it up, and they were out of about 30 to 35 oysters on here. We had 5 deaths right then and there. But what this picture on the right is illustrating, it is taken 2 to 3 weeks later. This is clearly showing that this damage done to these oysters by the silt coverage can be reversed in a short period of time. These oysters, I pulled these 2 traps up just this past week, and we had 10 deaths out of 30 to 35 oysters on here. And here we had minimal to no deaths. So what else did we learn besides the fact that silt coverage can be, damage from silt coverage can be reversed? But this year we saw no spat generation on these reefs. I don't get it. I don't understand why. Maybe because the oysters were way too close together and the spat knew there were just too many oysters there. There were less fractures this year, hardly any. And there was less silt damage. Oyster drill predation. Last year, I would pull these up every single time, 8 to 10 oyster drills. This year, 1 to 2 max. And it wasn't until the end of the summer that we even started to see them. Oyster survival was much better than year 1 because of them supporting each other, and there were less fractures. New paragraph, new page. That's what I used to say when I was a physical therapist. New slide. Yeah, I used to always say new paragraph. So our plans moving forward with our mini reefs. This year, we'd like to continue learning through these mini reefs, and we're going to place the oysters a little farther apart, but not as far apart as year 1. And we're going to keep them off the floor and continue to watch spat generation and fauna draw. Next page, please. We also observed oyster growth, but this was not too successful, so I'm going to breeze through this. What we did was we took 16 oysters that were really struggling, and we tagged them and painted numbers on them, and then put them in the bag, and we were monitoring how quickly their health recovered, and also monitoring their size, the length, the width, but what happened was the tags degenerated, the
numbering system failed.
The number system failed. Next photo. So this was our initial lineup. This was taken about a month ago. And what did we learn from this? Well, who was it? Henry Ford that said the only real mistake is the one in which we learn. Don't learn. The one which we don't learn. But we did learn some things, even though we erred in this, and we're going to do a better job next year. We lost the 6 youngest ones, and I was floored by that. I just hadn't seen, I was surprised we would see that. Back up. And the growth was much slower than I expected.
Shade.
But we put these in the shade while all of our other, under a dock, all of our other oysters are out there in the sun. So next year, we're going to look at the differences in growth in the shade versus the sun. Next one. So once again, I've got to give a big shout out to Matthew Gregg for drawing and creating so much life in the High Bar region. This picture is taken from Clam Island, and this is what I get to see every time I go out there. I just love watching the birds congregate and eating all the fauna that is drawn to his oyster cages. Can you imagine the life he is creating underneath the surface? Can you imagine the life that natural reefs would create? Please support your local oyster growers. I think they're doing a lot of good for us. Next slide, please. So these are just quick observations. Maddie tends to dump. He doesn't know I'm watching him, but oysters in certain areas. Here, he dumped these oysters in the subtidal zone close together. Just took this picture a month ago. Great survival over the winter. Intertidal zone, oysters far apart, not so good. Every single oyster is dead. Next slide, please. Other high bar observations we made this year. There is less spat on the mussel column, no doubt, which bothered me at first. I'm like, this isn't good. But there is much more spat on the oysters that are surviving. Oysters that were low on the mussel bed are living longer, and in areas of low current are not being pulled off the beds. They will in time, but they are not. They will fall off the beds. They get so big. Here, the picture on the left is showing the formation of oysters on high bar bulkheads and docks. Never in my 35 to 40 years there have I seen this. But what was interesting to me was the greatest growth was on old wood and not the newer chemically treated bulkhead.
Yeah.
Next page, please. So this is where I get really excited. I mean, a lot in life excites me, but this is the big thing I noticed this year, which has changed the direction of the way I'm approaching this. We found more oysters in what I call the vertical position. The body of the oyster is up. The mussel is in the ground. These two oysters have figured it out. I believe this is a teachable moment. We need to watch these oysters that are surviving and listen to them. But also listen to the ones that are falling head first and dying in the silt as a result of it. I believe what I was seeing this year, these oysters surviving in the silt with young spat on them at times, is their natural attempt to create a reef. Next slide, please. Not only did I witness a lot more vertically sitting oysters, but they were surviving longer on the mussel beds. As the oyster grows on the mussel bed, yes, it will be pulled off the bed because of the current, except if it's in a very low current area. Will they be lucky enough to fall into the silt with the oyster in the upward position and the mussel down? No, because the oyster is heavier. I mean, the current must have just taken this mussel down. I don't know why this one got so lucky. Most of them are found falling flat because the oyster is heavier than the mussel. When it's flat and lying in the silt, it succumbs to death. Next picture, please. So this is an example of what I'm finding on a regular basis right now, 80 of these in an hour. This is a picture of an oyster to me that's crying to be planted, saying, please plant me. So this oyster was lying, this side on the right was lying in the silt. That's why it's so dark. The one on the left was face up, and you could see through the silt a little bit of the white edge of the oysters. These oysters are still alive. If I took this, and I've been doing this, if I took this and brought it to an ideal condition where there's minimal silt, no silt, and these oysters would regain their color and remain healthy. If left in the silt, these oysters just die. So this oyster, we learned from the mini reefs that the oyster, a quarter to half the oyster can be in cement and survive.
Mm-hmm.
So here we have a 3-inch anchor in which this could be planted, living in the upright position, and have a very happy life. Next page, next picture, please. Here's another picture. This one, the oyster isn't a perfect one to plant. The one on the right was down. That was down. That's why it's so dark. These white edges on the left were what was sticking out of the silt. So this oyster is doing a little bit better than the one in the prior picture. This still could be planted. We've got about 2 inches to work with. It's not quite as good an anchor as the last one, but if this is taken out of the silt and repositioned in the right location, it will survive. Next picture. This one is one that was found just in this past week, that the one on the right was down in the silt. So this had recently fallen, minimal damage. Again, it's growing perpendicular to that mussel, which isn't the ideal planting situation, but we still have 2 inches of an anchor that we can plant. Next picture, please. So this is an hour's worth of me taking my kayak out and walking. I know where they are. I've been out in these sedges for 35, 40 years. So I know where they are. I can pick up 80 right now, nice size oysters that are all struggling under the silt. And that's what you see on the right. On the left, I've separated the ones that are suitable to plant and the ones that don't have an anchor at all and can be used for another purpose. Mm. But imagine if this is happening around every oyster farm. There's at least 12 plus right now in Barnegat Bay. And these oysters can be utilized for reef restoration. And you're not moving them from one area to the other. You're moving them sometimes 100 yards. Next picture, please. Here's another example of oysters that have taken a colony of mussels off of the sedge, fallen into the soft silt. This one is doing very well. The base fell down and the oysters are sticking up. If I left it there, it would get covered with silt because the silt was so soft. So we moved these to an area with a more gentle current and firmer silt. Next picture, please. So what do we really want to do in 2022? We're gonna, which is different than in the past, we're gonna clean and plant these healthy oysters with the mussel or mussel colony in a vertical position in low current areas with firm silt. High Bar residents are just amazing and very supportive of this project, and nobody's touched our sites or damaged anything. If anything, they're helping me. But we need to limit foot traffic if we're going to actually create an oyster sanctuary, an oyster young bed. And we need to, even though these jet skis, these young people on jet skis don't really realize what the damage it can do to run through these sedges. They are running through these sedges periodically, and all you need is one to ruin an oyster young site.
Yeah.
So we would like to put signage out there to avoid foot traffic and jet ski use. What we really need, and I have not figured this out, we need substrate in High Bar. We would like to surround these planted sites with substrate because the combination, there's hardly any doubt in my mind, is best to draw fauna, and the substrate will help support the oysters. We will continue to rehab unhealthy oysters doomed for failure and use them in a positive direction. And we would like to develop an educational site on the dike. Next picture, please. So this is what we want to see in 2022. Vertically sitting oysters, multiple spat on them. Here's one. It's doing very well all by itself. Teachable no moment. It's telling us what to do. It's telling them how they wish to survive in our sedges of High Bar. Next picture, please. So this is just an example of 6 oysters. So they all had a nice base, planted them, and we've got the current going against them, the thin side of the oyster. They are not moving. They are not budging if we find the right silt consistency. Next picture, please. And here's a picture of one of the, what we're going to be calling sanctuary sites. And we need substrate. We need substrate around these live oysters. Next picture, please. I'm throwing in there another project going on in High Bar. We're proposing a living shoreline project. This sedge to the right used to go all the way between the 2 houses on the top part of the screen, and it protected this lagoon. And without this land here, this lagoon is having some issues. So they want to rebuild that. We will be needing substrate for that. So anyone who can help us get a substrate up in High Bar, I'd really, really appreciate any efforts to get substrate, even if they dump it in my yard. Next picture, please.
That is legal.
So this is just another beautiful picture of Lynn's right over our shell bags. All this generation, we've never seen it before. It's stronger each year, but they're crying for help. They need help, and we need them. These oysters are givers. They help our entire ecosystem. They provide a hatchery for fish. They filter our waters, and they stable our shorelines. They deserve some help, and I know we can help them. So I'm hoping this lecture will generate a lot of other people out there approaching this in a similar manner.
I mean, it's just unbelievable, the knowledge you're gaining, and thanks for sharing it with us. And hopefully it'll put our organization in a spot to be even more helpful.
I hope so. I mean, I just want to improve the health of the bay and make it better than it is, because it's given me all this joy for 40 years.